Okay, over to you. Floor is yours.
Okay. Um, Sorry, let me just figure out my Zoom thing out of the way. Um, you guys are covering my slides. Okay.
We don't see your
Oh, are
presenter.
you seeing the wrong? Hang on. Is that better?
Yeah, perfect.
There we go. Okay. It's the two screens thing.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. Delighted to be here. Um, so yeah, I'm Ciara, as you know, and the work I'm going to talk about today is really work that I've mostly done in collaboration with my colleague Gillian Murphy, who's at University College Cork. So I think many of you will know of or know Gillian. So this is kind of really all work we kind of have done together, partners in crime. So I'm going to talk today about kind of some of the work we've been doing, looking at debriefing and more broadly about ethics in misinformation work. Um, and I suppose just, one of the kind of to begin with, I'd say that like this is something that we would really recommend that people do as a general rule. Like we kind of tend to try as much as possible to tag ethics questions onto the end of our of any kind of ongoing research project that we have. So, I mean, it's nice in that we get an extra paper out of it. You can write up another paper about the ethical questions. We've also found that it's really helpful with our ethics committees when we're putting in new projects that we're able to just smooth feathers by saying straight away, hey, we've actually evaluated all of this. Here's all of our papers showing that our methods are ethical and they're sound. Um, so yeah, and we would like to see more kind of meta science happening on that sort of ethical side of things generally. So okay, so you guys all really work in this kind of field of misinformation. So of course you know that debriefing is important. But if we think about, why do we debrief at all? Well, of course we know that misinformation research often requires deception, and that deception can be twofold. So the participants are usually deceived as to the true purpose of the study. So we're not telling them usually that we're studying misinformation at all. And then the materials themselves might be misleading or sometimes even harmful in the case of, say, online misinformation or fake news. And of course, we know that ethics codes of conduct, so the British Psychological Society, the Psychological Society of Ireland, and so on, do typically mandate a debriefing following deceptive research. And the goals of this debriefing, when we boil them down, essentially, is firstly to ensure that the participant has an accurate understanding of the real facts, so that they end up sort of being de-hoaxed, that they really know by the end, what it is that you really did and what everything means. And then secondly, the goal is really to try and undo any harm that might potentially have been caused by that misinformation. And so the implicit assumption here is then that debriefing works, that we actually can take back that misinformation. But actually, there's not a huge amount of work really directly evaluating that. So I'm going to talk you through a few studies that we have conducted to directly evaluate this. Um, so the first of this is a 6 month follow-up study to a study we did on political fake news. So this was actually our kind of one of our very first ever kind of fake news studies, and it was a study of the just that we conducted a week before the 2018 referendum on the Eighth Amendment. So that was the referendum to legalise abortion in Ireland. So about a week before this referendum, we paired up with a kind of a big online news site, the journal.ie, and we recruited over 3,000 participants to this study. Now that was, it's a big sample generally anyway, but it was a particularly big sample here because it was one in every 1,000 registered voters in Ireland. So you can imagine that at the time everybody assumed that this referendum was going to be really, really tight, and we had some sleepless nights thinking that we might end up swaying the result of the referendum in one direction or the other. And that ended up not being the case because the referendum was a landslide, but we had those concerns. So of course we were very concerned to know whether we were going to be effectively able to retract any misinformation that we gave people. So, as part of this study, we showed participants real and fabricated news stories about the referendum. So, this is an example here. We showed people a news story suggesting that either the yes campaigns, the pro choice campaign, or the no pro life campaign had been forced to destroy 25,000 campaign posters after it emerged that they'd been purchased illegally with American lobby money. That wasn't true. We completely made it up. Um, After the study, we fully debriefed participants. So we excuse me, Show the participants these stories again. Firstly, we asked them to kind of identify which of those stories that they had, all the stories that they had seen. We said, look, some of the people who took this survey were shown fake news stories that concerned events that didn't happen and that we had entirely fabricated. And we said, if you think you were shown any fake stories, please select any of the ones you believe to be fake. Then after that, so we're kind of asking people to sort of engage in this process of really thinking about which one might be fake. Then we reveal which of the stories that they saw were fake. Each participant had seen two entirely fabricated stories. And then we gave them a full explanation of the study goals. And essentially what we found here was that in our initial study, we had found fairly high rates of false memories for those fake news stories. And we found that those were really kind of quite sharply reduced from the original study to the 6-month follow-up. So if we take that poster story there about the illegal poster campaign, we can see here is the percentage of participants in the dark grey, the dark coloured bars here is the people who originally formed a false memory for that story. It's about 24%. And then the paler bars on top is the additional number over that who believed the story, didn't remember it, but believed that it had happened. And when we followed up with those participants, we got about 644 of them who came back at 6 months. And when we followed up with them, we found that they kind of had showed this kind of sharp reduction in false memories and in false beliefs at this 6-month follow-up. Now, what was interesting is that we also recruited an additional sample of entirely new participants who hadn't taken part in the original study. So this is that 477 there at the end. And when we showed those same participants those stories again, those poster stories, we found that they were likely to kind of falsely recall or remember or believe those stories at roughly the same rates as the original study, and at about kind of a 50% higher rate than the participants who had already been debriefed. So this was important because we were saying, well, the original study was conducted in this very febrile period just before the election, or for the referendum rather, and a lot of stuff can happen in the course of 6 months that might make a story just generally less convincing. So we wanted to be sure that it wasn't just that our story had become less convincing, but that our debriefing itself had actually reduced people's tendency to fall for that story again. So these are people who are seeing that same story again, and we're seeing that debriefing reduces susceptibility to that previously viewed story when it's encountered again. So essentially reducing that kind of illusory truth effect when you see something twice. What we also found then, what was very interesting, is that we showed all of these participants, both the continuing participants and the new participants, some totally novel misinformation as well, again related to the abortion referendum. So here, for example, we showed them this fabricated story saying that Facebook had offered a formal apology to Irish voters after evidence emerged that Irish voter profiles had been sold to Russian campaigners seeking to influence the referendum outcome. This wasn't true. We made it up. And again, we found really quite nicely that, a certain proportion of those new participants would fall for this story. About 15-20% of them kind of fell for this fake story. And that percentage was sharply reduced among our continuing participants. So that previous debriefing that we had given them 6 months earlier seemed to offer some protection against exposure to future misinformation. Okay, so that was our first study. We were quite pleased with the results, but we were also aware that 6 months is a very long time between initial exposure and debriefing and then follow-up. So, it's possible that people's memory or belief might just naturally fade over time. Maybe it's nothing to do with the debriefing. Maybe it's just that it has disappeared over that period of time. So we wanted to evaluate whether the debriefing was still effective on a shorter timescale. And this was particularly important in the context of COVID-19, when, of course, people are being kind of bombarded, as you all know, with an awful lot of health-related misinformation, and the kind of media landscape was changing very rapidly. So it was important to us to understand how our debriefing might be affecting people's behaviour on a shorter timescale. So here we examined a 1-week follow-up following exposure to COVID-19 fake news. So in this study, we essentially at time 1, we recruited participants and we showed them 6 news stories. 4 out of those news stories were true, and they also saw 2 fake stories. We had 4 fake stories, and each participant saw a randomly selected 2 out of those 4. Um, we were evaluating a lot of things in this study. We were evaluating the effect of this misinformation on behavioral intentions, and on belief and on memory and various things. So after they saw these stories, participants reported their behavioral intentions, they reported how truthful the stories were, and then they were fully debriefed using the same protocol as we've used before. So the news stories that we showed here, just very briefly, these were stories that were designed to have a potential impact on people's behavior, or at least on their behavioral intentions. So we showed them stories that were designed to get people to increase their consumption of chili peppers or of caffeine, to reduce their willingness to get a vaccine, and to reduce their willingness to download a contact tracing app. So we wanted to specifically measure their effect on behavior. Okay, so 1 week later, we followed up with these participants again. We started out by asking their behavioral intentions again. Okay, so they have previously said whether they intend to get a vaccine or drink more coffee. And now we're asking them that again 1 week after they've been debriefed. Then we showed them all of these news stories again. So this time we showed them all 4 of the fake stories. So 2 of these were stories they had previously seen, and 2 of them were completely new to them. Okay. And then we also showed them 4 true stories. And again, these were just kind of selected out of 8 possible stories. So they saw 2 stories that they had seen before and 2 completely new ones. And again, they rated the truth of those stories. We had a second debriefing, and then we had a post-debriefing memory and belief assessment. So to look at the different measures that we were interested in here, first looking at false memories. So we found, if we look at the darkest bars here, those dark navy bars, this is the original reports of people's intentions to engage in the targeted behaviour. And you can see, I'm sorry, beg your pardon, this is their initial false memories for the stories described. And you can see there's a lot of variation there. So some of the stories were essentially more convincing than others. So about a quarter of participants reported a false memory for that contact tracing story. It was lower for some of the other stories. So there was kind of variable. But across the board, what we found was that when we looked at those repeated stories, which are those kind of middle bars, or the totally novel stories at time 2, that we found that false memories for both the repeated and the novel stories were reduced following that debriefing. So when we assessed them at time 2, we're seeing a reduction in that continuing belief for stories they've seen before, and also a reduction in false memories for stories that they have never seen before after they've been debriefed. We found a kind of a roughly similar pattern for truthfulness rating. So belief in the fake stories was reduced following debriefing for both the repeated and the novel stories. And then if we look at behavioral intentions, what you'll see here is essentially kind of nothing to see here generally. Essentially what we had originally found was that there were only very small effects of the fake news exposure on behavioral intentions. And so there were some effects, but they were really very small. We had a very large sample, and they were very small effects. But any effects that there were completely eliminated following debriefing. So there were no differences between any of the groups after the debriefing in behavioral intentions. So there was certainly no kind of sleeper effect or anything like that, where exposure to the misinformation had, kind of continued to increase to affect behavioral intentions. Okay, so those were 2 fake news stories. 2 fake news studies, rather. And the third study is a little bit different. So in this study, we're looking at the effect of debriefing following a memory implantation study. So this was just published early last year. And this is a follow-up to a replication of the Lost in the Mall study. So I'm not sure how familiar people in this lab will be with kind of false memory research generally, or Lost in the Mall. But the Lost in the Mall study was a famous study conducted by Elizabeth Loftus and Jacqueline Pickrell in 1995. And in that study, they recruited 24 participants along with an older relative, usually a parent. And then they essentially managed to kind of persuade these participants that they had gotten lost in a shopping centre at the age of 5. And in that original study, they reported about 25% of their participants formed a false memory for having gotten lost in a shopping centre, an event that never happened. This was kind of, kind of one of the early proofs of principle of this idea that people can form rich false memories. And it's been very influential, but it was by no means a perfect study. It had various methodological flaws, and it was a small sample. So we decided to replicate this with a very large team of students. We had, I think, 10 master's students working on this project with us. It was a huge team effort. So we recruited 123 participant and informant pairs and essentially replicated this study. So just to show you the kind of the rough outline of how this study works, we begin by recruiting participants along with their parents. Okay, we first get in touch with their parents, and we ask their parents to tell us various details about their child's life when they were around the age of 5. And we asked them to tell us about true events that happened to their child. So, things like, when Timmy was 6, we went camping on a campsite in Wales, and it rained and his shoes got wet or whatever. Okay, and we also asked them to tell us details about where the family would have gone shopping when the participant was about 5 years old, who would have been there, what kind of shops or aisles would have appealed to the participant, and so on. And we also got the participant's parents to confirm that the participant had never actually been lost as a child. And if they couldn't say that with high confidence, we didn't include the participant in the study. Okay, so after we had that information from the participants, we put together, the first part of the study was a survey. And in this survey, we sent out kind of summaries of these events to participants. So they were sent summaries of 3 true events that had really happened to them as a child, and this one fake event about getting lost in the mall. And that was always presented as kind of in position 3. And this is just very much following the original Loftus and Pickrell design. And they were asked to just, in response to reading each of these prompts, to write as much as they could remember about the event. And then we followed up with the participants. We did 2 interviews with them about 1 to 2 weeks apart. The interviews were conducted over video because this happened kind of towards the tail end of the pandemic. So we had to begin with video interviews, and then we stuck with that for consistency. So we interviewed the participants at length about their memories of each of these events at 2 different periods. And then at the end of the second interview, we debriefed the participants. And we went into it was a very detailed in-person spoken oral debriefing about the nature of the study. And then we did a follow-up survey 3 days later, where we asked participants to, tell us whether they still remember the events. And we also asked them various ethics questions about how they felt about the study. And then just to say, in terms of how we coded these memories, we relied on a coding scheme where we had 2 different researchers who would independently code each transcript for the presence of a memory, and they would code whether it was a full memory or a partial memory. And at interview 2, and then again at the follow-up, we also used a self-report approach where we asked participants, yes or no, do you remember this event? Okay. And just to kind of very briefly summarize the results, what we found was that by the end of the second interview, 35% of our participants were coded as having experienced a false memory for the fabricated event. And that exceeds the 25% of false memories that Loftus and Pickrell had originally reported. And you can see there as well that on the second half of the figure there for our replication, there's this lovely kind of increase, which is honestly exactly what we would expect, that in the palest bars there in the booklet survey, we see a relatively low level of false memories. And at each stage of the interview, the number of false memories increases as participants are encouraged using fairly suggestive methods to recall the details of this event. So the replication was successful according to our pre-registered criteria. And we had said that we would consider it to be successful if the rate fell between 15 and 35%, which it did. We also evaluated self-reported memories for the event and beliefs in the event. So do you remember this event happening? And do you believe that this event actually happened? And what we found was that rates of false memory were lower using a self-report measure. So participants employed a more conservative criterion for evaluating their own memories, but they also used a substantially less conservative criterion for evaluating their own belief. So only 14% of participants reported remembering the event, but an additional 50% told us that they believed that this event had happened. Okay, so this is immediately following at the end of the second interview. And if we look at the purple bars there, immediately following the debrief, we see that those false memories reduced immediately following debriefing and then further reduced again by the follow-up 3 days later. And the rates of false belief reduced very sharply from 52% at interview 2 down to 7% at the post-debriefing. So there are still some participants at the end of this debriefing who are still reporting that they remember that this event happened. Okay, so we really wanted to delve into those. We wanted to look at what was happening with these participants who said, I still remember that I got lost in the shopping centre. And essentially what we found when we kind of cross-tabulated participants' belief in the event with their memory of the event, what we found was that the vast majority of the participants who reported still remembering the fake event after debriefing didn't actually believe that it happened. So these are what we would call non-believed memories. So non-believed memories are things that we all have. So a lot of people, for example, might have a memory of seeing Santa Claus come down the chimney when they were a kid. Okay, as an adult, you no longer believe that happened, but you might still have the mental image of it. Okay, so that's a non-believed memory where you can still have the mental image in your mind, but you don't believe that it happened. And if we look at those kind of that 69% of those participants who still had a memory did not believe in the event after the debriefing. Okay, so that left only 4 participants who both had still retained a memory and believed that the event had happened. Okay, and in fact, when we kind of looked in even more detail into those participants' transcripts, we actually figured that there's a decent chance that those 4 participants might actually have been lost and that their parents might have been wrong. Because these were participants who had been very clear and very consistent from the booklet all the way through to the interview that they actually had gotten lost, and the detail differed quite a lot from the details that we had given them. So we think that those participants may actually have been lost. So our conclusion from this was that the debriefing did successfully remove the false memories and the false beliefs that were created during the memory implantation study. So just to summarise there, we found that a careful debriefing procedure reduces false memories and false beliefs for fake news. It's effective from 1 week to 6 months post-study. It offers protection against future misinformation, and it successfully retracts implanted memories of childhood events. So there are some questions we still want to investigate there. We want to do some comparisons of different kinds of debriefings. We're in the process of doing that at the moment. We're comparing the difference between sort of an active and a passive debriefing. So the difference between participants just being told, hey, these stories are fake and, you know, we lied to you, thanks very much, off you go, versus an active one where they really have to engage with the debriefing and really think about it and answer questions about it. And we think that's going to be particularly important in the context of sort of prolific type participants who tend to kind of skim debriefings based on the time they spend reading them. They tend to sort of skim them because they're getting paid by the minute. So if we really want to try and make people engage with those debriefings, we think they might be even more effective. But we're still working on that. We had conducted one study where we looked at that already, but actually in that event, the rates of false memory and false belief in the false events were actually very, very low. So we weren't able to evaluate that and to compare the two. So we have some other studies at the moment where we're looking at that. So we know that debriefing works, but do we actually do it? And who actually does it? So the final thing I want to talk about here is a scoping review that we published a couple of years ago. And this was work done with my postdoc at the time, Constance de Saint Laurent. And we collaborated here with Toby Pryke and Uli Ecker in Australia on this research. So we did this, we essentially kind of said like, right, let's look at, you know, the hugely increasing prevalence of misinformation and sort of fake news research over the last decade. And you can see there, say, since 2016, 2017 on, there's this enormous shooting up in the amount of research being published. The number of Google Scholar hits there going from essentially 0 for fake news up to about 35,000 in the space of 5 years. So an enormous amount of research in this space being conducted. So we wanted to know, what are people actually doing in terms of their debriefing procedures? So this was a very large scoping review. You can see we started out there with nearly 10,000 papers to screen. So this was a big piece of work. Our inclusion criteria, we were looking for empirical articles that focused on evaluating the effects of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, false news, fabricated news. We just focused on articles published in English. And we focused on articles published 2016 to 2021, since 2016 is when we see that big spike. So we also then excluded, because obviously misinformation can also refer to eyewitness memory studies. So we excluded those. We're looking really at kind of online misinformation. And we also excluded studies of hypothetical misinformation, like how would you feel if somebody told you that this thing had happened? So we were trying to look really here at the kind of misinformation. Our kind of guiding star here was looking at studies that present people with misinformation that might actually potentially have some real world consequence for them. Okay. So we ended up at the end with 340. So we started out with those like nearly 10,000. We ended up with 346 studies to extract. And then this is just to show you the kind of the prevalence of ethical practices occurring across each of these kind of different domains. So I mean, if I'm not going to ask you to shout out, but if you kind of were maybe to guess on some of these, just for that first one, really, there, like what percentage of papers do you think that are studying this in this narrow field, so studying misinformation, fake news, disinformation, and presenting it to participants and evaluating their response to it? What percentage of those papers do you think report debriefing their participants afterwards? Anybody like to potentially guess? So I've got some guesses coming in here, like 95%, 85%. Konstantinos is a little bit more cynical, says 37%. In fact, all of you are too generous because it's in fact 27%. Okay, only 27% of papers reported using any kind of debriefing at all. Okay. Of those, only 2% of them give a sort of general debriefing, like, "Hey, we gave you fake news." The majority of them, if they gave a debriefing, it was a specific debriefing, that focused on the specific information they've been given. 0.29% evaluated the effectiveness of their debriefing or obtained post-debriefing consent. And in fact, I can tell you that those were our papers, so no one else was doing it. Steve, you've got a question?
Yeah, I do, because okay, I mean that's sort of shocking at first glance, that it's only 27%. But are what are you counting here? The reports in the paper that says
I'm
participants.
glad you asked. So yeah, so this is so yeah, I'm glad you asked, because this is important, right? So this is whether people said in the paper we debriefed
Yes.
participants. Okay, and we're
Okay.
going to come to this now. So just to note, in this paper as well, we did also look at the frequency of open science practices, which were lower than we might hope as well. But that's just there if you want to have a look at it. But of course, we did then say, okay, people will often do these things and it just doesn't occur to them to report it in their papers, right? So, let's like actually ask people.
Yeah.
So we followed up with everybody, the corresponding author of every included paper. We sent them a survey and we followed up with them actually to a kind of embarrassing degree, really, really hounded them to respond to a survey. We had 86 respondents to this survey covering 97 papers. Okay. So in this, we asked them about all of these practices that we had evaluated. So things like, did you, warn people about the presence of misinformation? Did you debrief them? What kind of debriefing? Did you obtain post-debrief consent? And did you engage in these open science practices? So the first thing to note here is that there's a lot of data in this table, but if I just kind of draw your attention to this box here, just to the debriefing part. The first thing is that among this sample, you'll see that the percentage reported in the paper is higher than in the general sample. So already we're kind of obviously selecting people here who are already doing slightly better than average. So these are, you can imagine there's going to be a response bias here, that people are more likely to respond to the survey if they think that they've a survey about, ethical methods, ethical approaches, if they think they're doing things fairly well. So among these participants, 37.5 had reported using a debriefing in their paper. That number did go up quite a lot when we asked them, do you debrief your participants? But you would expect that would be 100%, right? So even when we asked people straight out, did you debrief your participants? Only 73% of people told us they did. So nearly 30% of people didn't debrief their participants at all after giving them real world misinformation. Okay. And when we looked at, in a related paper, we looked at the kind of the content of misinformation, and by and large, really like overwhelmingly, a huge amount of this misinformation is it's political misinformation or it's health misinformation, with a massive spike for COVID. So these are potentially consequential forms of misinformation that people are not debriefing. The next question you probably are asking is, yeah, but who are these people, right? Because we know for a fact that there's likely going to be a big difference between psychologists and non-psychologists. And in fact, that is true. So we know that, People who come from a psychology background usually belong to professional organizations that have ethics codes. We have training on ethics. We have to submit ethics applications and so on. So we figured there was probably was likely to be a substantial difference between people who were, would kind of papers that were published in psychology versus non-psychology journals. And we judged that based on how they're defined in the literature. And essentially, yes, we did find that. So we found that papers published in psychology journals reported engaging in all of these practices at higher levels than non-psychology papers. Now, this here, of course, is the reporting in the paper. We did also look at this for the survey, but we're talking about much smaller samples. Then it becomes less reliable once you break it down into all of these subsets. And so on the whole, we're seeing, yeah, psychologists are doing it more than non-psychologists, but even psychologists are not doing it all the time. There's still a very large way to go in terms of recognizing those kind of ethical requirements and open science requirements while we're on the subject. So we conclude this paper with a big long list of recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of these in great detail. I'm not going to read all of these out, but there's a long list of things that we recommend that researchers should think about. Obviously, engaging in a debrief. There's some specific things, like we do say, you should really only debrief people about the actual misinformation that they saw. So it's what common thing, because it's just for convenience, is to say, okay, you might have seen any of these stories in our study and they're all fake. But then that runs the risk of confusing participants, because now the story that they were never shown before. So we recommend just debriefing the ones that they actually saw. Sorry, that's that part. We also kind of recommend, you explaining the kind of, if there's an argumentation strategy used, explaining what that is. We recommend, providing additional relevant facts where appropriate. But of course, it can be very tricky to try and do this in such a way as to avoid potentially alienating participants and avoid the potential of bias. So making sure that any true versus false designations only refer to the factual information presented, and not to anything that might be a matter of opinion, like, not kind of getting into details about, like, well, these people are all wrong, whereas it's really trying to stick as close as possible to the science, providing access to information, if possible, testing participants' understanding of the misdirection. So really seeing that, like, this is part of that kind of active debriefing process, really testing that people understood how you misdirected them and what really happened. Offering post-debriefing, the opportunity to withdraw consent post-debriefing. We do this as standard in all of our studies, and we find participants very, very rarely take us up on it. But anecdotally, we find that people actually really appreciate that offer. Because, of course, technically we should do this, because somebody who has been deceived didn't really give informed consent to take part. So now that they are informed, they ought to be offered an opportunity to withdraw that consent. A final one that we have added that wasn't in the paper, but we have added on, is the suggestion to debrief participants as soon as possible, and ideally before they leave the study session. And this is because we've identified a trend sometimes where, usually for experimental purposes, participants aren't debriefed for a fairly long period of time. We do have other various suggestions about how to get around that in cases where it's not possible to debrief them immediately, but how to kind of to avoid potential consequences there. But that's essentially all there is there from me, and I'm very happy to take any questions. I'm just seeing these questions here now. So the non-psychologists, Konstantinos was asking about that. Yeah, so there was a really wide range, actually. So there was a lot of kind of political journals, a lot of health journals, a lot of kind of demography and population population science kind of journals. But particularly we found, actually, we did a huge scoping review of, like, what people study when they study misinformation and all that. We did these two scoping reviews side by side, and it was huge. And really what we found with a lot of those was that, particularly around COVID, I'm sure you guys have seen this too, the amount of really poor quality research in the misinformation space really sharply increased. So there was a lot of people, like, investigating COVID, but in a fairly methodologically unsound and often kind of not very ethical way, where they would just be like, we want to know whether people in X country are susceptible to misinformation. So we gave them a survey with all of these items, and then we didn't tell them that these things weren't true. We gave them a whole list of myths about vaccines, and then we never told them that those were not actually true statements. Um, so that's actually potentially causing harm rather than just studying something. So, yeah, so like a huge range actually across the non-psychology disciplines. It was about by 2021, it was kind of 50-50 about psychology versus non-psychology. Earlier on, it was the majority of the papers were psychology papers, but COVID really changed the shape of that. Simon, question?
Yeah, it's more of an observation than a question, which is to say that having having done these type of studies through three universities, Surrey, Bath, and Bristol, I'm amazed to hear that any of the ethics departments will allow people to do this without a debriefing. Um,
Yeah, me too. I do think that it's a lot of that, as I say, does come down to that idea of psychology versus non-psychology. Because one thing that I think is important is that a lot of other fields going through ethical approval isn't standard. Should be because it's human subjects research. But in a lot of fields, people don't think they have to. If they're just sending out a survey, they don't see that as something they need to get ethical approval for. And they don't see it as something potentially harmful. In fact, when we sent out that survey to the authors, we got a few very defensive responses of people saying, but we didn't show people misinformation. And we're like, well, you did. You gave them the whole list of vaccine myths and then didn't take it back. So some people just didn't consider that what they were doing was showing people misinformation, but we had quite tight criteria for what we counted. Um, so that's kind of one thing. I think people just not going through ethics reviews at all, or people sometimes in a lot of depends on the jurisdiction, but in a lot of places you can kind of put in a like a kind of like a sometimes called like a low risk review,
yeah.
or like a kind of like a self declaration that your study doesn't need review, and then it doesn't go on. It doesn't really get full. But I would always think that research like this always should go through a full ethical review. But I think in many cases it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, if you're deceiving people, I would expect it to go through. I
Yeah.
In my most recent one, I had written a generic debrief, which included those people that had been deceived and those that hadn't, and I was specifically told that I needed to provide two different ones.
Yeah, and
I
that's I'm,
also
I'm
like
glad you
the
were told
idea
that because I
of
think that's yeah.
I also like the idea of involving people in some way, getting them to respond so that they're actually taking notice of what they're being told. I've never done that before, and that's something that I think I
So
should
so
do.
anecdotal, and this is just purely anecdotal because we are still working on this. Anecdotally, it does seem to make a difference. That if we actually like this kind of active debriefing where we really like. So we like it would be very simple. It might be things like we show people the debriefing and then they just have to answer a multiple choice question about what it said, and
Yeah,
they have to get it right before they can move on.
no, that
And it
seems
just kind of forces them to engage. And even that part of saying like, which of these stories do you think is fake? So asking them to actually really interrogate their own in response to the stories. Excuse me. So each of those things do we like as we don't have full data on it yet, but anecdotally they do seem to be effective.
that's very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks. Stu, do you have another question?
Okay, thanks. Well, you mentioned prolific and how to do debriefing there and how to ensure that happens. And one of my PhD students a few years ago, was studying radicalization, around Islam, Islamist and Islamophobic radicalization. So debriefing was pretty important. And so, if I recall correctly, what we did was to chase people who didn't spend enough time on the debriefing sheet, which we
Mm,
could measure on prolific, or who canceled out before they sort of.
yeah.
And we effectively, went after them. And we couldn't force them, but we gave them another opportunity to watch the debriefing video. I think we had a video and we had extensive material because we wanted to make sure. So it can be done. And
Yeah.
I can't recall now what proportion of people we were chasing up, but it's certainly possible to re-invite them. And
Yes. And one thing we do as well, I didn't get into this here, I think it was in
okay,
it was in our recommendations, but one thing we do as well is we'll always, when we're doing, say, like a survey, say on Qualtrics or whatever, we'll hard code in a button that's like, if you want to leave the survey early, don't just close your screen, click this end survey now button, and that brings them directly to the debriefing. So that's trying to capture those people who might just say like, oh, I'm bored of this and I'm leaving the survey early. And we find that because it has to go to a separate survey, we can count how many do that. And we do capture a reasonable number going through that as well. So I think all of these things, I don't think any of them are exclusive of each other. I think all of these things are really important to try and capture as many people as you can. And obviously, the more sensitive the information is, the more important it is to do that.
Mm.
And Konstantinos?
Thank you for this fascinating talk. One idea that I had is there's this constant conflict between economists and psychologists about the use of deception, and economists generally look down upon psychologists for using deception. And it would be very interesting to have psychologists like yourself and economists, maybe like Andreas Ortmann, who has collaborated with Hertwig, and co-author a paper about these elements that you're discussing here with debriefing, because
Yeah,
there are some
absolutely.
economists.
Put us in touch. I do think I think there's a lot of debate with economists and psychologists generally. Like economists tend to have very different views about reusing participants as well, and like so there tend, but also like I suppose it depends on the nature of the question you're asking as well. Like a lot of the time, with the economics stuff, if it's kind of economic games and things, then the misinformation isn't as harmful, So that's kind of one thing. But yeah, I think a lot of the time it is that thing of it's worth questioning whether you actually need to deceive people. And in this space, a lot of the time you do, but sometimes we jump to it without it necessarily being necessary as well. So, Dawn, question there?
Yeah, thank you. I was really fascinated by the earlier part, especially where you're talking about the people who might still believe things afterwards. And I wondered if you'd have collected sort of people's tendencies, like beliefs in that or attitude towards the topic beforehand, and whether that informed whether they would still hold those beliefs, that congruency with their
Yeah, we did, and that is So, yeah, we had a we had a huge project where we were looking at this, and that was one of the questions was whether the debriefing would be less effective if it, depending on people's pre-existing opinions, and we could see, kind of a couple of it's very entangled because we have a lot of evidence showing that people are more likely to, for example, in the memory space, people are much more likely to form false memories for things that are ideologically congruent, and does that may also make them more resistant to the debriefing? So we had a big project looking at all of these things. But in the event, this is the same one where the main thing just it really didn't work. The people didn't kind of really fall for the misinformation at the rate that we expected them to. So then all of those subsidiary questions that we wanted to investigate, we couldn't. But we do have a couple of other studies going on at the moment where we're investigating exactly that question. So yes, I think it's entirely likely that the effectiveness of the debriefing will depend on people's pre-existing views. One area where we're seeing this kind of stuff coming up is we've done some work recently with climate change, and we explicitly were trying to recruit like an even number of climate change believers and deniers or skeptics. And the climate change skeptics they're a special group of people, but they their reaction generally to they had this extremely suspicious attitude to everything, and particularly to research and to us as researchers. So even like when we showed them any material or showed them the debriefing, they were sending us angry emails, convinced that we were using this study was just like a blind, that we were trying to use this as a way to kind of to manipulate them and to recruit them into believing in the falseness of climate change. Those people would never have bought our debriefing anyway because they believed that we were fundamentally compromised. So that they you can't take these things in isolation from the individual people.
Yeah, I mean, I asked the question because I work a lot in the, anti-vaccination argumentation space, and there's two things. One, sometimes people have very entrenched views, so they don't think it's misinformation to begin with. And two, argumentation is not all wrong. So
No, and actually, I think it's a really important piece of that. And Gillian and I have been talking a lot about this recently. One of her students has been doing a lot of work on it in the kind of conspiracy theory space, right? Where you'll have this idea that people will talk about people who, conspiratorial ideation and people who believe in conspiracies as though they're all wrong. But there are real conspiracies in the world. So, there was a real conspiracy among tobacco companies to, withhold information about how smoking causes cancer, for example.
But yeah, but the people who believe those correctly tend to be different people. I mean,
They do. So, but I think the
it is
point is just
very
more that if you're,
rare that I mean, well, Alessandro can, he knows everything about conspiracy theories, but the people who believe conspiracy theories that we call conspiracy theories because we're pretty sure they're wrong, they tend not to believe the actual conspiracies. It is.
well, there is a difference, remember, between conspiracies that have already had, like, for example, the smoking one that I gave the example of, we now have tons and tons and tons of evidence. There's no real question
Right.
about, what that, but if you had said in 1960, this is a huge conspiracy, people might have looked at you quite differently. So there is that different thing when we have this evidence. But I think it's more that thing of like that with that sometimes when we're trying to say debrief people or debunk things with people, that we can go too far in saying that if it goes to that line of saying you must believe everything that everyone tells you, and that if a scientist or a politician tells you this is true, it's conspiratorial of you not to believe them. So I think that's where things can go too far, and we need to be very careful about
Mhm.
giving credit to our participants as well for like, assuming that they're actually able to understand that distinction,
Yeah.
and that we
And
don't essentially tell people that they're idiots if they don't buy everything we tell them.
yeah, no, I mean, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, we obviously shouldn't do that. But how would we? I'm not sure. What are you warning us against? I mean, how can I debrief somebody that makes them feel like an idiot?
Well, I mean, I've read some debriefings that are basically like, that will write about these things in very insulting terms. Like some people believe this stuff, but it's clearly nonsense, kind of an approach. And you're like, well, because and what that all that does is get the backup of somebody who's like, well, I did fall for that. Are you saying I'm an idiot? And it's kind of, or you're saying that I'm really easily duped.
Yeah,
So,
I guess I haven't seen that.
yeah. No, and I honestly, I doubt anybody in this lab would be doing that.
Well,
Like,
I don't
you
know.
know, you
Maybe inadvertently I have, and I just didn't spot.
Um, but
But
I think it is that thing of treating our participants in good faith and assuming that they're acting in good faith and that they hold their beliefs in good faith and that we
sure.
treat them as intelligent, rational adults who might disagree with us on things and that we can present them with evidence. But like there are people who will never accept the evidence when you give it to them. It's just
Yeah. Well, yeah. Although they're the ones that are actually very difficult to get into the experiment
yes.
in the first place because they have a lot of opinions about science, but they've never come near it.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely. I mean, so we like with that study, those studies we were doing when we were trying to recruit the climate change deniers. It was, you go through Prolific and you get your data in about 5 minutes, but it took us weeks and weeks and weeks to recruit the deniers because they're so even well. I don't want to say there's so few of them, but there are so few of them who report explicitly on a scientific platform that they don't believe in climate change. So they're actually very hard to obtain. So like I think it is like that problem of difficult to access populations, and that then in the interests of expedience, we just kind of we don't recruit them, and then there's a big gap in our knowledge then about what people believe or how people respond because we're only measuring that in a certain subset of the population.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I don't have the answer to all of those questions. They're still work in progress. But I think honestly, like the biggest thing that I would say is I would really, really encourage everybody to do this, to like the ethics thing is certainly not like my main interest is memory. So, but like we tack on the ethics stuff onto a lot of our studies, and it's pretty easy win. Like you kind of add a few things onto the end of a study and you can get some really rich data. I didn't have time to present it here, but we have lovely data as well where we followed up with participants to ask them about their views of the ethics of deceptive research. Which was really nice. Like, as I actually nobody had actually really done that before, and actually asked these participants, how do you feel after you do a study where it turns out that the researchers lied to you? How do you feel about that? Do you think it's okay? Do you think it's acceptable? And we got some very insightful responses from participants. We did quantitative and qualitative analyses on that, and like but what we found on the whole was that most people were very supportive of deceptive research as long as they're properly debriefed. So that was reassuring to us that we didn't have that sense of everybody was leaving really annoyed. that they were leaving feeling like they'd gotten a good explanation, that they understood why we had done this, but that there were boundary conditions. So we asked things like, how would you feel if we did this with a child sample or an older adult sample? Or how would you do if we didn't debrief you now, but we didn't debrief you for a week or for 6 months or for a year? Or, all these different kinds of conditions around it. And there were boundary conditions in what people found to be acceptable. But we found that quite reassuring on the whole. Konstantinos?
Yeah, I was just wondering what kind of sample would respond in this way, because I'm thinking that maybe it's the Democrats and the progressives who are usually the sample in online research, and whether you have checked whether there's a difference in the reaction of these two samples.
No, we didn't. And I think that is a very important point. Now, I mean, I think on the one hand, you could say, like, if, in the studies where we did evaluate that, it was, that we hadn't specifically selected a particular demographic for the study. It was a kind of a, broader demographic. So you could argue that they are representative of people who sign up for research, and therefore that is an important sample to evaluate. But what we haven't done there is evaluate those questions in those harder to reach and more suspicious or skeptical groups. And I think that is an important part to evaluate as well. And there is that general idea of, distrust of science and of scientists. And I mean, if anybody here has some amazing tips about how to overcome that, I would love to hear them.
I mean, I don't know if you can actually approach exactly these people, but at least you could counterbalance in prolific for Republicans and Democrats. So that could be a proxy.
Oh yeah, well we do
at least.
that too. Those are depending on the, obviously we don't always use American samples. Like it depends on the nature of the study. But yeah, no, we often do. And we don't always use prolific either, because it depends on what questions we're evaluating. Like, for example, prolific has a fairly low rate of Irish participants. So when we're studying stuff in Ireland, prolific isn't terribly helpful to us. So we don't really use it there. We have other means. But then, those things that, like, we've partnered a few times with an online news organization to recruit participants in Ireland. But then, of course, you have a different selection bias there of people who read online news and are likely to click a link in an online news story and take part in a study. So you always have these selection biases. And I'm not sure that we're able to necessarily like fix all of them, but I think at the very least, I think you're right that we have to be aware of them, and that there are limitations to what we can conclude based on the sample that we're using. Dawn?
Yeah, this is more in response to your question about suggestions for how you actually reach the people who are
Yeah.
not likely to be on. And unfortunately, this is not going to be an easy fix. I'm just because I do some work in which we're sort of partnering with community organizations who are out there and have the links into those groups of the population who may be very, say, resistant or
Yeah.
not getting vaccinated, and no one else can reach them. It's so hard for any one corporate or like research institutions to do those, but the groups on the ground can do it. But unfortunately, that
Yes, I was having great conversation. I was at a
methods and prolific where it's easy.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, it is that balance of like it's convenience versus actually getting the people you want to get to. I was at there's like this national disinformation strategy group, and I was at a meeting of that, and it was a range of people from all these different backgrounds, academics and policymakers, but also community activists and people coming from all different backgrounds. And we had some great conversations about exactly that, about trying to access hard to reach groups. So I think that is something that we might try and follow up on, and I'm going to really work with. Like one example of that, I suppose, at the moment is I have it's not even particularly a political group, but I have a visiting student here for 6 months from Brazil, and we're looking at a misinformation around tropical diseases and things. And one of the things that we're going to be looking at is trying to get access to, there's a huge population of Brazilians living in Ireland. And they tend to, there's just like, I'm not totally sure why, but there is. But they tend to live together, they tend to work together, tend to have very little contact with the rest of the country. And then there's kind of concerns that you have groups like that don't have, access to the same information. Like, for example, so this student is, like hanging out with all the Brazilians. And then last week I was saying to him, and are you prepared for the big storm? Because there's this huge storm coming and everything was going to be closed. We had a red weather warning. Everything was going to be closed. And I was like, are you prepared? He hadn't even heard about the storm. He didn't know it was coming because he wasn't in contact with anybody who was reading like mainstream Irish news, you know. So like he was like this very kind of like subset of people who are very difficult to access. So we're kind of trying to think about that idea of getting in with getting access to groups of people who maybe are exposed to different news meet different news environment, and using those contacts to try and get access.
Okay. Well, I mean, we're sort of